All right, welcome everybody. Today is Thursday, May 17th, 2018. You are at SIG Architecture on the office hours version, and I'm your host, Jay Singer-Dumars at Google, and we're going to get started. The agenda, should you want to look at this after the fact, is at bit.ly/sig-architecture. And today on the agenda, the first thing we have is Mr. Daniel Smith talking about feature branches. Go ahead and take it.
Hi, no, I'm not muted. Can you hear me?
Affirmative.
Okay, great. It's pretty early in the morning, so hopefully I'm still working on my first cup of coffee.
And you're in the dark.
Yeah, I'm still at home. Yeah, and I got in late last night from a one-day trip to GlueCon. So yeah, what can I tell you about feature branches?
Well, there's been some discussion about sort of projects starting to use these and what the mechanics of it around that are, and sort of how the decision to move forward with those was made, and pretty much just trying to have a discussion around the mechanics and how this might apply to other places and how this impacts the project currently. So
Sure.
Maybe you could just start with what you're actually doing.
yeah, that helps.
Yeah, I mean, I can just give you a short bit of history. When we originally shopped around the design to move kubectl apply to the server, I had sort of a casual mention in there. Oh yeah, we'll probably do it in a feature branch because it's pretty invasive. Then we started ramping people up on this, and they're like, well, actually, a feature branch is going to be a lot of work. I don't know. Let's just do everything in master. So we gave that a shot, and it turned out a lot of people had gone along with the plan because they wanted to see it done in a feature branch. So we switched courses back to doing a feature branch to avoid, because we want to work on actually making stuff and not having discussions about feature branches. So yeah, so that's where we are. We made a feature branch in master, in the main repository. We have done a little bit of stuff there. We've been doing everything that can go into master. We've been putting in master. So like I did a large refactor of the patch handler, which then allowed Jordan to go delete most of it. Yeah, so that's where we are, and sort of the reason, like, why is this appropriate for a feature branch and not master? And it just comes down to, like, this is a huge chunk of work. It's not entirely useful until it's all done, and doing it in a single PR is just out of the question.
And it's not going to be in 111, is that correct?
That's correct. But because it's in a feature branch, we're going to work through code freeze.
Yeah, I think that's one of the main values of feature branches, is to make sure that we don't have half-baked code going into the release. I mean, certainly that's my main motivation.
And have we added like useful tooling around release branches? Like, does CI work and those sorts of things?
So when we first turned it on, we had like 2 or 3 things that were broken because the what's it called, prow or whatever, assumed that anything that wasn't a release branch was master, and that there was only one master. But Jeff and Ben the Elder, they fixed that for us. So
That was a tied issue, or what? Like, what was the actual problem that you encountered in terms of which batch of tests ran, or what line in this NICU, or?
It was something to do with the verify test itself. It needed to know what branch it was on, and so like the test couldn't even run.
I see. Yeah, so there was some other issues in the past. Like one of the biggest issues was you couldn't actually turn up tests on a new branch because it required creating new GCP projects and things like that. And all that has been fixed. It's now basically, did you even have to submit a PR to spin up tests on your branch?
No, they just worked.
They just worked.
Yeah, fixed.
Yeah, so that stuff has been fixed.
Yeah, I think it was the characterization of non-master, non-release branches, like what bucket the CI stuff considered that to be in.
Yeah.
That was the trick.
But it seems to be working now. The thing that I think is still not quite working is the submit queue. It tries to batch everything, and because there's low bandwidth on the, or there's low rate on the feature branch, there's not much to batch it with. So we basically always lose out to something else and have to, if it's not like a documentation only change, I've been manually merging to the feature branch instead of waiting for the bot to do it.
And how about owners files? Another issue that people ran into in the past was the approval automation didn't work in an ideal way.
I haven't any problems with.
Well, that's probably because you're a top-level approver.
Okay, fair enough. I wouldn't know.
Okay. Yeah, so that might still need to get sorted out. But, just so everybody's clear, all the code is getting reviewed in a normal way, correct?
Yeah, that was the idea. I think we've all at this point arrived to the conclusion that stuff going into the feature branch is going through the normal process. It's not like a lower bar. The only difference is, like, if we're clearly going to do something in many chunks, then you don't have to have a complete chunk to get it into the feature branch. It just has to pass tests. Right. So
yeah, I think the main benefits are that we don't ship something halfway, and that you can keep working through code freeze.
Yeah,
you don't have to slow down the feature branch at all.
Right. Yeah. What I'm really looking for from this is the ability to actually have a bar to say, no, this can't ship in the release because it doesn't have adequate testing, or because.
So I think a feature branch is going to work just fine as long as there's only one, because we're pulling stuff back from master occasionally, so we won't have a huge merge problem when we go to reintegrate. If there's two or more feature branches, somebody's going to have a bad time when they start reintegrating.
Doesn't that depend on whether they're changing the same thing? Tim Sinclair's next.
I mean, maybe I'm biased because the feature branch that I'm working on is likely to change stuff all over the place. So.
Yeah. I think if we just document like what it is we want. I mean, we're talking about a lot of the minutia and the logistics. I think the point was, if we're going to do this, let's document the details, so that way it's clear what the process is and how we're going to do this in the future, if we are going to do this, or if this is kind of a test case scenario, and to find out where everything breaks. I think the concern came when, like, I was looking through my PR backlog that I had to review, and then I just come across like massive PRs, not knowing that feature branches were a thing. And then I saw the rebase PRs, and it was like, oh my gosh, what is happening? Because it's very scary. So if we had automation that
the wrong branch.
Yeah, exactly. If we had automation that basically said like feature branch or something like that, something that documented the process so that it was clear to other folks who are reviewers or whatnot for PRs that get auto-labeled, that it's clear.
To be clear, this is an experiment, and it's to surface issues exactly like that. So on that one, I suggested using the original feature branch issue in the community repo as a log to accumulate these kinds of experiences and action items.
Yeah,
So.
and eventually we can create a KEP around what the process will be or whatever.
Joe, you had something?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as we run experiments like this, it's still, I think communication is key here in terms of what are the bounds of the experiment, what success look like, what are the impacts, right? And I think, anytime, using sort of the scientific method or experimentation, there's usually a little bit of formality around sort of what you're looking to learn and how you're actually doing that. And so, it's easy for those things to get hidden in an issue. So I think it's just a communication thing. And I think, it's the fact that somebody like Tim got surprised says that,
well,
they need to do a better job of communicating this, because Tim's more plugged in, honestly, than I am. I was surprised on it too.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying from the perspective of this group. It probably is an experiment. From my perspective as somebody trying to get stuff done, I'm just trying to get stuff done.
We thank you for being a guinea pig.
Well, but I mean, but some of the questions is like, what happens when somebody says, "Oh, feature branch, I want one of those too," and then we end up with 100 feature branches, and they're all integrating, and it creates a ton of noise, and then like, and and it overloads our CI/CD system.
Yeah, I'd be happy to have that problem. So far, I've seen the opposite from people. Like, oh, feature branch, I'm never going to touch that. So I don't think we have a horde of people wanting to use them.
Well, the other thing is
because they don't know about them.
Almost nobody has permission to create them.
So like we're doing something different here than what any other open source project would do. Like in the Linux kernel world, the feature branch is just a branch. Like go do your development somewhere else and call us back when you're ready. And the fact that you were able to plug it into our CI pretty much seamlessly is kind of neat. It's also kind of terrifying because if we decide feature branches are the way to do big development, then we're going to have more of them, right? If 2018 is the year Daniel proves that it works, 2019 is the year that we have 100 of them. And when we have 100 of them, we will have CI overload. Not that we don't have it already.
I think the rate of churn on those branches is much lower than the main branch. It's not clear to me that the CI load is going to be higher.
Right.
But the whole idea here is to actually allow faster development. So I would expect that the return against all this feature branches would be due to increased velocity.
Well, it's all relative. If you look at the graph in Kubernetes, due to various factors like the system maturing and it becoming harder and harder to make changes and us moving code to other repos, for the past 5 releases, velocity has been declining in Kubernetes. And I don't see that radically changing. I think if we can use this as a way to clean up some of our technical debt and improve the quality of the system, like if you note what Daniel is doing, is not really adding a feature. He's cleaning up a bunch of debt. So,
yeah, sort of.
Wait, you don't think the server side applies a feature?
It
results in API changes. I mean, like this is pretty clearly new functionality.
It's replacing functionality that is widely used.
I think from a user's perspective,
I'm not saying like it doesn't deserve a KEP or whatever, right? It had a KEP, but I'm just saying it is not net new functionality.
Yes, it is. It's new APIs. We're moving stuff from client to server, and in doing so, we're creating new things that we're going to have to support over the long term, right? Like Kube Control and Kubernetes API server are 2 separate projects. But we're adding features to one and we're maintaining them in the other ones because we have to have backward compatibility. So we're net new adding code. So I'm not saying it shouldn't be done. I'm just saying, like, let's not put our head in the sand and pretend like this is just a refactor. It's not.
I don't know that this is even relevant to the discussion. I'm sorry for the tangents, but
yeah, I was going to say, I think one of the things we're talking about too is we're trying to be able to more effectively enable the kinds of changes that make the project better without them being fully committed and get the test stuff. So I think, Joe, to your point, like the disruption caused by incrementally changing master is far greater. And so we don't want to block that stuff, but we do want to optimize it differently. I mean, maybe that's arguing that these sorts of branches are more about a specific type of change to Kubernetes. And we start with that as the bar. Like, this is about a significant change to Kubernetes that is experimental, that needs deep review and deep feedback, needs a KEP, needs all these things. It's not really for someone going and like adding a feature to the kubelet. That's not really what it's about.
I'm fine. I just want to make sure that this shit doesn't get out of control.
Yeah,
I mean, that's my concern.
There's nuance there, right? Like if the feature to be added to the kubelet is, I don't know, I can't come up with an example off the top of my head, but if it's going to require a dozen PRs across the course of a couple of months,
like, I don't know, it's some sort of like heartbeat checking for kubelets or something.
Sure.
So we probably should wrap this up because this is starting to go into the dark recesses of rat holing.
Yeah, I agree.
But if anybody wants it to do of writing some documentation or proposal around how we might handle feature branches, that would be super
I think that's going to come from the learnings of actually trying it this time. So I think the action for this time is to communicate that we're doing this experiment and to start documenting the things that we need to fix.
And that we don't expect other people to be doing it yet.
Yes, exactly.
So
that's the biggest thing.
I would say I actually don't think that we learn a whole lot from just doing one feature branch. Like I said,
this is the second one though.
Well, I think you don't really test it until you're doing two in parallel. I think that's when you get the interesting problems.
That sounds like a good second experiment after we actually get it working with one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Feature branch merge hell.
So I would definitely not like demonstrating that it works, like a concept demonstration. That's one thing, but before we would generally recommend people do this, we definitely need to see how it works when people go to reintegrate.
Okay, so calling time on this issue. Wojtek is here to discuss the efficient node heartbeat proposal. The main issue, I think the only issue the debate, and Don and Derek are the reviewers, they're not here. The only issue that really came up was CRD or built-in API. So I just want to explain my position on that because I'm responsible for the proposal to use a CRD. So we've been discussing for a really long time now that we want to slow the growth of APIs in core. We have about 60 built-in APIs. We decided Service Catalog would use aggregation in order to put pressure to mature that extension mechanism. We've talked about starting new APIs, extensions as an additional step in the maturation process. We haven't really tried that to date. But also as this system, as we've been developing the system, it's become clear that we need to make the API machinery more and more generic and turnkey. And we've done this even with the built-in APIs with things like the generic registry, which was implemented a long time ago, which removed most of the new etcd-related code from every new API. And we've been progressively moving down that path with things like CRDs and KubeBuilder, which can be used for built-in APIs as well as CRDs and things like that. So my position is we need to be building API machinery that makes it easier to build APIs, whether they're our APIs or someone else's APIs, and that we shouldn't think about CRDs or aggregation as extensions anymore. They are mechanisms so that we don't have to build a monolithic system. We're getting to the point where it's dangerous, where people are looking at Kubernetes. I mean, it's been true for a long time, but it's becoming more and more true, where people will reject it because they believe it's way overkill for what they actually need. And it's becoming also just harder and harder to build and ship a reliable thing with so many pieces. So that's part of the reason why I made the layer proposal, so that we could find fracture points where if someone wanted to or needed to, we could potentially shed functionality or repackage it in a different way that was more suited to their use case. But in any case, so I think CRD, we decided for some definition of that the extension mechanisms need to be part of the nucleus, so that we can build as much of the rest of the system as possible on those generic mechanisms. So don't think of CRDs as extensions for other people. CRDs and aggregation, especially aggregation from the beginning, was intended as a mechanism to make it easier for us to build Kubernetes. And I'm viewing CRD as the same way. So whether core versus non-core, I don't think is a useful distinction for whether we should use the mechanism. Whether the mechanism is ready for this use case is, I think, what we should consider. So, performance was raised. That's a legitimate concern. Wojtek said he would benchmark it. Some concerns about, maybe versioning or something else that we need might not be there. Those are legitimate concerns. Like, I'm not going to lay on the tracks for this specific API, but we need to draw a line somewhere. And this one I had rejected in the past, as Tim Sinclair well knows, as well. We don't really need any custom logic for this. Like, there's no controller for this API. It's just data. And in fact, because we have experience using this exact API through client libraries, but just as annotations on config maps and other resources, I think we have pretty high confidence in what the shape of the API needs to look like. So anyway, that was kind of long, but I just want to put that out there, that we should make this decision based on concrete technical issues, not based on perception of what the mechanism is for, because that, as the mechanism matures and becomes more capable, I want to seriously considering moving some of our existing APIs to the new, more generic mechanisms, especially as we replace some of the V1 core APIs with new APIs, for example.
It's this last part that really resonated for me, the idea that we can move from custom resource definitions to just resource definitions, and really build and extract the machinery that serves the API from the machinery that defines the API. I think if we could do that, that would be an amazingly good result. This seems like a reasonable place to start for me. I think this one's fine because it doesn't have high coupling with other stuff. I know there's other proposals in flight where I'll make a different argument probably because they have higher coupling to existing resources.
Yeah.
So I have a question, because as both a person who works on core and consumes things externally and creates controllers outside of the core, what's difficult and that uses the APIs, what's difficult is the shifting every release cycle. So like every time there's a shift in API groups or promotion or whatnot, eating that is a non-trivial cost. And I'm sure, as Jordan's here, so he's done enough OpenShift rebases to speak to this at length, that anytime APIs change or move around, the cascading dependency graph of things, it can be very expensive, right? So as long as we have a well-defined process for this, like we were going to do it slow and methodically for how we do these changes, I'm not terribly concerned, but I'm surprised Clayton and Jordan don't have opinions on it too.
So I know that we're doing, if we're talking about like the core V1 APIs, we're doing one right now, which is event. Although actually I don't know how actively Merrick is or anybody else is working on that. But I think that's—
I think there isn't any active like development on this.
Okay. So we did replica set, which we did as a net new API that shares some of the implementation with replication controller. We can debate about whether that was the right choice or not, but that's what we did. Event would be one where we'd actually be converting between a V1 API and a new API group. So when we do implement that, we'll see how that goes. I think for CRDs, we wouldn't be changing the API group if we, say, converted it from a CRD to a built-in. I think that might need some investigation to determine whether that's possible to actually do.
How? Go ahead, Jordan.
I was just going to say that, so switching between CRDs and sort of natively compiled in APIs, as a client, obviously you don't care, you're just speaking to an API, but actually managing those transitions internally, I think gets really thorny really quickly. Like stuff starts moving around in storage and trying to do a clean handoff between API servers. And even just in the group migrations we've done, like trying to get stuff out of extensions V1 beta 1, even just going from one native handler to another native handler has proven very difficult. I'm pretty skeptical of being able to cleanly switch from a CRD to a non-CRD or the other way around in a non-disruptive way.
I would hope that mostly we would go the other way around, where we'd be converting built-in to CRDs. Yeah, I agree that we haven't tried that and there's not a good way, and moving things out of extensions is painful. I think that may be the biggest argument for a built-in API is that we don't have high enough confidence in that it can stay a CRD.
So can I talk a little bit? Because I have a few thoughts. First, I definitely agree with what Brian was saying. Like CRDs are ways of building APIs, or not ways of building extension APIs. Like that's not really a thing. It's either an API or it's not. I think I think in terms of performance, I've been thinking about this lately, and I think there's a very good chance that eventually we're going to offer proto interface to custom resources. I don't see any other way. I wouldn't expect that tomorrow, but I think it's going to happen. In terms of CRDs as they are today, like, are they ready for this use? I need to investigate a little bit, but I'm pretty concerned that there's some CRD controllers that aren't 100% HA safe. Like I think every extension API server is running a controller independently, so I need to investigate that some more. There isn't currently versioning support. We're hopefully going to have some by the end of this, or by the end of code freeze. Do I think that this would be fine as a like this should be a very small object? So even if you're doing JSON, my guess is it would be fine, but it should probably be benchmarked. But yeah, just the main point is we are building ways for people to make APIs. CRD is a way to make APIs. There's no like first, second, third class citizens among APIs. Like you're in the API system and you get all the features, or you're not in the API system. Like the reason why you go with a CRD or an aggregated API server isn't because you want your resource to be more or less core. It's because you need more or different options on the storage end.
Well, I don't think that's entirely accurate. Like the whole you get all the features might be aspirational, but that's not even close to reality.
I'm saying, yeah, yeah. So I'm claiming that is the aspiration. CRDs are definitely not feature complete today. They're not even.
Yeah.
Okay.
And many of the trade-offs are, validation is more expensive, right? It's doing dynamic kind of schema-based constructing of a validator instead of a hand-rolled validator. One is more declarative, less performant. One is you can do any validation you want. When Wojtek is doing the performance analysis, I think it would be important to compare, like with validation, like to make sure that the schema of the thing was actually enforced, apples to apples type comparisons. But a lot of those trade-offs were done with an eye towards, you can hook in a custom API and you get these performance characteristics, and they're different, but it is useful. So if we're wanting to characterize these as the way to build all APIs from now on, like our current scale expectations need to start coming into play, and they haven't in the past.
So I definitely, I think this is probably a larger scope than was originally envisioned for CRDs by the people who originally added them. I think that we're going to have to go there.
So another position, sorry, Clayton, another position we could take is that policy APIs should use CRDs. We could start down that path, because those are also mostly just data, or they use admission control, but it's storage class or something like that. Could have been, maybe, probably.
Yeah, and I was going to ask this from the other point. If we weren't writing to this every 10 seconds with ON nodes, with like O nodes, would this be an issue? Like, would we be having the same discussion if the write rate wasn't so high? Jordan?
The performance is one big piece of it. The fact that this API must be, like, a core piece is depending on it. And so a lot of the things CRDs let you do, like flexibly change a schema and modify things over time, experiment with APIs and be flexible. We actually, those are anti-features in this case. We don't want there to be any possibility of this API breaking. And really so
define it. So I don't know.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, maybe it's not the right thing for this API, especially since versioning doesn't even exist yet.
I mean,
I would like to draw a line in the sand at some point.
At a high level, I agreed with everything you said in the beginning, Brian. Like, I do agree that if we treat CRDs as crappy APIs, that's one mental model. And the other mental model is we need to go improve them. Like, it's kind of, we're in this weird spot of dying on this particular hill for something that started as a very performance sensitive part of the system. Like, do we have any other candidate that would be a better one besides policy?
Probably something like scheduling policy, or the new, some new volume storage related thing.
There's snapshots coming, but snapshots is interesting because it has tendrils off into persistent volumes. And I think we'll need to decide at some point if the idea that custom resources are just resources, if we decide that that's true, we'll need to decide whether it's okay for core resources to have cross-references to custom resources.
See, I feel like if we have to make that distinction, then they're not resources. Like, so maybe Jordan, asking another way, does anybody on the call, Jordan, maybe you specifically, want to make the assertion that we shouldn't use CRDs for APIs that we think are important? Or is it just the performance characteristics?
The original or one of the statements was people find like the core Kubernetes stuff like overwhelming, like there's too many core APIs. And it seems like a shell game to say, oh, well, we're not going to define another core API, but we're going to make it a custom API, and you have to create it, and it has to exist for your nodes to work. Like that.
I think specifically the argument is that the core group, like core V1, is difficult to understand because there's so many things in it.
Well, I think there are multiple arguments. I mean, that's one of them, Joe.
If we took away the argument, go ahead. Sorry,
so I think it's one of, and we can use conformance to actually, do some of this as we add more policy layers, as we add, more features. Can we do it in a way where those things are optional, separable, and you can actually, dial those things in when they make sense for you? I worry about, oh gosh, Carl from, ex Mesosphere Carl on Twitter is like, when are we going to add a tenant that's like in addition to namespace? And, obviously this is a perennial sort of type of thing. Like that doesn't make sense for everybody. If like that is something that comes out of multi-tenant, we need to do that in a way such that folks aren't forced to think through that to even get started, right? So, maybe the node specific stuff is not the right place to start, but I am super, super encouraged that we're having this discussion where we're taking a very, very critical look at every single new object. So that is good. Yeah, that's
okay. So Matt, and then we're calling time on this.
I just wanted to say, we're not the first platform that's had to go through this layering things on environment. I've dealt with this a little bit before. So I'm up for jumping into the discussion on it. Should that happen here or some offline where a handful of people get together to kind of figure out guidance that kind of says, how do we do this and why?
Probably a little bit of both.
Okay.
Yeah, I think ultimately it ends here. The buck stops here. If other people want to make a higher bandwidth channel that has less people in it, I'm fine with that.
Maybe I'll take it to the mailing list then.
Yeah, that would be great. Like I was hoping that the layering proposal, for example, would inform this. Like everything in the governance layer, policy, higher level automation that people might not necessarily need, things like that. But definitely policy sort of stuff would all be considered optional and would be some other like conformance profile. And if that all that stuff could be built as resources that could just be turned off in a very lightweight way, that would be awesome. Or
so we can move on because I see somebody already said we should call time on it. I will offer to take this to the mailing list to continue it there.
Cool. Thanks, Matt.
Okay, Wojtek. And let's try and time box us to 10 minutes because we've still got a really important discussion about the charter to go.
So, by the way, I think
this was this one.
Yeah, I think the outcome was just do a built-in API, Wojtek.
Okay, I see. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, so this was this topic, Jace.
Oh, okay. Sorry. My bad. All right. So then are we on to the charter discussion?
Sort of. I wanted to take a step back from the charter, but first I want to ask, since this is technically office hours, whether anybody had another topic that didn't officially get put on the agenda that they want to discuss.
Eric Feda had one in there that just needs to be looked at. So if people want to click through the link that he had about declarative org administration, that would be helpful.
Yeah, that is the thing that we've asked for a long time, or at least part of it, to be able to define GitHub team membership and things declaratively. So that's awesome. I don't think it's a SIG architecture specific issue, actually. It's more of a...
Can we build it with the Kubernetes style API?
I think it's probably YAML, but it's hopefully not a Kubernetes style API, yeah. Yeah, I just wanted to, moving on to the kind of meta charter discussion, I wanted to step out of the weeds a little bit and go back to kind of first principles about what we actually want SIG architecture to do, because I think that affects things like how SIG architecture is organized and what subprojects there are and who should be responsible and things like that. So I brought up the issue a few times about, what do we actually want to accomplish? Are we being effective? How can we be more effective? How can we achieve our goals sustainably? And I think all those things definitely will influence what we need to formalize. The part of the original goal for creating SIG architecture was to create kind of an official, more visible home where more people could participate and observe a bunch of the technical decisions getting made that were done through email and in other meetings that kind of had certain known suspects who've been in the project basically forever were involved. And I think we've kind of been effective at that. And many of those usual suspects come to this meeting fairly often, where other parts of the goal was kind of to democratize that a little bit, to get more people involved, to better communicate the design principles, increase consistency across the project, percolate that to the SIGs that are actually doing the work. There are about half a dozen SIGs that are doing most of the work in the core project, things like networking, storage, API, machinery, node, and a couple others. I don't think we've been doing a good job really at helping them improve the level of consistency in terms of applying API conventions, design principles, and so on. I have written a couple of docs. I discussed maybe we should go out and present that to the community. We have held office hours. Not that many people show up. We haven't been very good about proactively seeking people out and getting them on the calendar to actually come. We haven't set up the formalized API review process. We did create KEP, but it's not sort of in full use yet. So I just want to revisit like what we actually think are the most important goals for this group to achieve, and how should we go about doing that. And then we can go and kind of revisit the charter discussion and think about what really the right subgroups of the SIG are and things like that. Because I see we have maybe, looking at the people who showed up, like 2 new people maybe, and otherwise like a pretty small consistent set. Any other thoughts on that?
So, I mean, it becomes, is one of the goals to bring in lots of people, or do we want to kind of have it available and have the small consistent set, have that time set aside to debate and get into these things?
To clarify, I don't think we need to bring in a lot of people. We need to have people who are willing and able to do work to help produce some of the artifacts that we need to communicate out to the rest of the community. I think we need to potentially change how we operate. Like if we're going to bring people in, we should more proactively try to bring people in. If we want to do outreach and go present at the SIGs or something like that, then we could do that. So I think one of the main goals has to be outreach. Because I don't, having a bigger group of people to bike shed, I don't think is going to help. But what we need is to take kind of collective knowledge of the people who have that knowledge and spread that knowledge throughout the project.
So it just in my experience, if we can get a lot of people in, they'll be quiet at first, and some of them will be flies on the wall, some of them will go, and some of them will get engaged. I don't know if we went for a lot more people, we'd get a mass number more people debating things. Because the people who really want to debate come and give their opinion. It's fantastic. So maybe if we did more outreachy stuff, that would get more people there, especially things like, just tweeting when the meeting's going to happen 10 minutes before, because people go, oh yeah. There's little things, sharing it in Slack and stuff like that reminds people who are already busy, oh yeah, this thing's coming up. Let me go jump on that call. Because I've heard more than once somebody say, darn, I missed the meeting, because they're just not paying attention. And so I will.
Oh, sorry.
That's my 2 cents. Joe's got his hand up too.
Yeah, Joe.
Yeah, no, I think breaking down sort of the responsibilities across maybe like 3 main points would be helpful here. In my mind, there's a point around defining and implementing and enforcing policy around sort of things that are levers for what Kubernetes is. These are things like conformance. These are things like API. So that's one thing. The second thing, and the branching stuff, I think is maybe part of that. I don't know, that like maybe that really should be part of SIG release, right? The branching discussion that we had, or maybe, I don't know, right? There might be a different group for that. The second issue is one of reviewing and providing a forum for folks to talk about things that actually impact a large part of the project, so that we can become a clearinghouse and an education place for folks to understand sort of like, hey, here's a proposal that's going to impact a lot of folks, so that they don't get into that mode where they write a lot of code only to find that somebody put the roadblock up at the last minute, because that's a very frustrating experience. And then the third one is to hold opinion in terms of what the most important things are for Kubernetes as a project, and then outreach and incentivize people to actually put their efforts there. So in my mind, those, and maybe there's stuff that doesn't fall into those categories, but that seems to encompass a lot of what you said there, Brian, I think. I don't know.
Yeah, I think those, at least, kind of the first thing, I don't know how you broke up the points, but one of the earlier things you said about setting down policies and conventions, technical guidance for the project, that has been definitely a consistent, clear goal of SIG architecture. That definitely aligns, defining what the scope of Kubernetes is. Those things I try to capture in the sub-project breakdown. But for the charter. The other things I think are part of the outreach part of the mission. I think those are good. They're not distinct sub-projects, but they're kind of part of the mission.
But on the point of, so there's defining what Kubernetes is, and then there are identifying the lever points which we can use to actually keep things consistent. And so like API review is one of those places where it's oftentimes when people expand scope for Kubernetes, it comes in through the API, right? So really reviewing and keep an eye on an API is a highly leveraged way of understanding what is happening in the project and where we might be overstepping the bounds of what we think Kubernetes should be. So I think we view that as a tool for helping to enforce the scope.
Right. Yeah. At one point, I guess back up to about 1.2, it was possible to watch all the PRs and going by.
That's long gone.
That's when I gave up. We tried to build some automation to auto detect changes to types.go files and things like that. That ended up being super noisy. And over time, it became even more noisy with people submitting these like auto spell check PRs and things like that. But we could go back to try to do something like that, to have more automated detection of these things. And another thing we could potentially do is, actually one way that we might be able to detect is whether new proto fields are generated or something like that. And there may be a way that we could distinguish material changes from immaterial changes that didn't exist when we tried before.
So this idea in my mind comes from a manager of maps at Google who he was managing a huge team, but still managed to keep a pulse on what's going on. And what he did is he made sure he reviewed everything that touched a proto file. Right, that was his way of actually creating a highly leveraged overview of what was happening in a large project.
this is effectively what I proposed right around Christmas time of having an API review, whether that's this meeting or a separate meeting, but exerting tight control over anything API related and saying that there's a small group of people who have to be involved in every API change. And I'm not even sure the immaterial changes are immaterial. Like changing the comments on a field actually are pretty impactful.
Yeah, that's true.
Right. And so if you want to make a change to the API group, it should just become part of the de rigueur of making changes. You schedule something with the API review group, you get it in early, you show them what you're doing and explain why before you produce 10,000 lines of code that implements that API.
Yeah, and those things should be slow, right? I mean, it's like these are big things. They're weighty decisions, adding stuff to the core API at this point.
You know, I spent my time at Sun, and I don't really want to reinvent the architecture review committee because that process was hell. But I do think that the API is important enough and central enough that we already have a small group of people who are approvers for API. And I think we need to formalize the process around it. And the mechanism of how do we auto-detect it or enforce it, I sort of feel is secondary. If we assert that, you know, thou shalt come to API review, any changes that don't come through API review start to get beaten on. And
I think it still would help to formalize as much of that as we can, because that will help smooth the process.
Of course, if we can automate stuff, and that's great. But if we just simply tell people so that all the reviewers understand this touches an API, therefore it has to come to API review, even if it's trivial, schedule 5 minutes at the API review and they'll take a look at it.
So what is the Venn diagram between SIG architecture structure in terms of technical leads or sub-project leads or whatnot, and trying to accomplish some of those things where we have specialized review groups, or, you know, what does that look like? Because I feel like there's been some consternation around the idea of technical leads at all. Like, what is that role actually supposed to do? Whereas a lot of our reviews should be highly technical and very specific to the job, and not just some general, you know, wizard hat wearing tech lead. You know, so what does that look like? What does that Venn diagram look like?
Well, so that's where I pulled out API governance as a specific sub-project and put people on that sub-project that had been doing a large number of the API reviews for a long time, who helped develop the API, write the API conventions, write the deprecation policy, things like that. And as I think we should train more reviewers, right? And that was part of the whole motivation for the review approval split generally, which was to bring in more people to participate in the review process to hopefully eventually train them up so that we could make them approvers. Right? And you earn that by doing the job, right? So Jordan is the person that was added most recently to this small set of API approvers, because he was just reviewing a ton of APIs and doing a really awesome job at keeping. He's very meticulous. He kept everything consistent. He understands the conventions. He helped write some of the conventions.
Yep.
So that's the kind of people that we want, sort of at the approver level. But having more reviewers, I mean, there are lots of people who can read the conventions and try to help apply them and then escalate up when they're unsure what to do. And that's how you learn the ropes. Right.
So I think there's a difference between reviewers and actually having a review committee, right? I think there's a certain set of things that are serious enough that making sure that you get, you know, plurality of eyes on those things is going to be important, right? I think like there's a lot of places where things make progress inside of Kubernetes because, you have somebody writing code in a reviewer and boom, 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 they're making progress, and that's awesome. And that's healthy. I don't think the API should be one of those. Right, so maybe the reviewers can actually tee things up so that it'll sail through the API review process. But I think we should, in my mind, there should be, because it actually is indicative of the boundaries of what Kubernetes is. It should have an extra set of processor eyes on top of it.
Well, certainly, if someone is adding a net new API type, I want to make the bar for that really high.
Yeah, just like this discussion we had around CRDs and what fits and what doesn't. That's exactly the type of discussion that I think we should be having on every major API change. I think maybe it's just a matter of degree. So, but to get back to Jace's point, there is a certain amount of what are the most important things for the project from an architecture point of view. What are the, what are those boundaries? How do we define those? When a, far-ranging KEP comes through, is there a set of folks who are actually going to really be able to give a thumbs up, thumbs down that'll carry weight to actually help people from wasting work, right? Those are all activities that, there are going to be a group of technical leaders that are going to help define that stuff, and it's going to be pretty high stakes stuff. And so I think,
yeah, I think
I'm not sure we can like split that up into 12 different groups. I think the API stuff definitely could be split out, but like at some point there's like architect leads, right? Or the architecture review, group or something like that is going to have a set of folks who mind meld around this stuff and put in the work to review this.
I mean, isn't that this group? I really feel like the overall architecture review group, the arguing about CRDs and those sorts of things, is this group, and it's an open group in the sense that anybody can show up, and there are people here whose names I don't know, which I think is fantastic.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, and meanwhile, the old hats can argue about things, the new hats can learn how to and when to argue about things and build a name for themselves, which is fantastic. I think API is special, and that's why I made that proposal around Christmas time.
Well, I think the question is what is the decision-making process? Like, who can say no? Can anybody say yes? I mean, it tends to be what we've had in the past is failure modes where discussion goes on, and the person submitting the proposal or whatever has no idea who has authority, and they eventually just give up. And that has happened in a bunch of cases. Probably there are examples of the opposite happening where not enough discussion happened and someone said yes and something went forward. I can't think of any. There are definitely way more examples of the other case. But I think somebody, I'm kind of two minds of this. On one hand, I feel that cohesion and consistency are so important to the system that consensus is really important for amongst a certain set of people for a bunch of these decisions. Just another observation in terms of, is it going to stick? Getting people to do things is much harder than frustrating people enough that they will stop doing something. So if we're going to say that a certain set of goals are important, actually making that happen is going to, in many cases, require actual authority by people who can set priorities for the people who would work on it. And that's just a practical matter that we have to realize.
I just question whether, I mean, the idea of technical leads that is developed as a general thing across all SIGs, I just feel like that's maybe falling a little short, like Joe had talked about, a counselor or some more, I don't know, collectively collegial way to handle those decisions, and all the consternation around, company membership and whatnot. I feel like in terms of orders of priority, having deep technical knowledge of the API, those are the people I want to be reviewing this stuff, not necessarily token members of companies. And so to me, that whatever satisfies that and also satisfies the secondary need of not having hegemony across one company, we need to think outside the box and make that happen, because I feel like the technical lead construct right now is not working for us.
So, for SIG architecture, though, I think having a named set of people working with modified consensus, and when that consensus fails, which hopefully won't happen that often, we do need to be able to actually have something to fall back on to be able to make progress. Because right now, when the consensus, like, number one is that it's not, we don't have clear timelines of like, hey, look, unless there's significant things and this thing is like good to go at this point, we don't have that set up. And we don't have a way to deal with significant objections, and force the issue, right? So we avoid it and things sit, and then the decision doesn't get made, and then everybody gets frustrated. So I think we just need a decision-making process, and I don't know how to do that without having some set of stakeholders that the buck stops with them. And I think we need to make, like, that doesn't even need to be a small group, but that needs to be a bounded group.
But I do agree with Jace about the company membership. I mean, you can look at the dev stats and see, like, practically speaking, the people who have more bodies working on the project are going to have more ability to get stuff done than the people who have nobody working on the project, right? And
there's, I don't, like, the map is not the territory. Not all work is equal. Not all,
yes,
stats is an approximation of activity.
I totally understand. I agreed with your previous messages about the stats are dangerous and all that. It's just an indicator. It's not the truth.
So
but
I'm confused. Are we arguing about whether we need TL or like a formalized TL role?
Well, that is one thing that we're debating, yes.
Or are we just arguing that we need to write down what the process for decision making is and what the scope of those decisions are?
So I think we need, so, like, if somebody says, hey, I want to do a CAP and I want to, like, make some wide sweeping change, right? And we get deadlocked amongst this group, or we can't, there's, like, how do we actually drive that to a decision, yes or no, for folks, right? And I think that's the critical thing, is we need a process there that is bounded and deterministic. I think we suspect, and I'm not going to say that it must, but we suspect that includes some named group of people.
Okay.
And then there's the question of, like, if we do have a named group of people, how do we actually form and determine, and what are the constraints around that group? Yeah, I got a hard stop in a minute, so.
Me too.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess we carry that forward.
Yeah, the charter discussion is ongoing, but I did want to have the discussion about, like, what are we actually trying to achieve first, to make sure that we actually focus on the right things there. Because I actually think yeah. Anyway, continue later. Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.